All right. So Gardening 101, we do Gardening 101 on the fourth Wednesday of every month. This week, we're going to be talking about dividing perennials with Doug Ruhren, who has divided more than perennials than he probably remember. And he's going to talk about it from soup to nuts and a variety of different plants. So thank you.
Welcome to Gardening 101 here at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. I'm Douglas Ruhren, the garden's manager. The topic today is dividing herbaceous perennials. And herbaceous perennials are those plants that live from year to year that lack permanent woody stems. They are the opposite of trees and shrubs, which are woody perennials. And in general, when we're talking about herbaceous perennials, we also mean winter hardy herbaceous perennials. But this kind of division we're going to demonstrate today can be used for, your houseplants like Spathiphyllum or a begonia or something. You can divide them as well. I want to start off talking about the tools of the trade. Garden forks, which are also known as spading forks, are the tool I use most often for digging up perennials and dividing the bigger ones. They come in two different styles. The type that most of us own have these flat tines. You can see they're much broader than they are deep. And if this is what you own, you don't need to go out and buy the other type. But if you're in the market for a fork, don't buy this type with the flat tines, because the moment you encounter a rock or a big root, the tines will bend. You can see how one of these is bent far out of alignment with the others. This other type with the tines that are square and cross-section, I've used the same fork for, a good 10 years or more, and the tines still have not bent. So a good garden fork with square tines is going to cost you more money, but you're going to love it every time you use it because it's such a good tool. I often use a weeding knife, which is a real sturdy, solid steel blade. I use it for many, many different purposes, but it's really good for dividing perennials. You can sort of wedge it into the crown and cut things apart. Some things come apart real freely, but other things need a tool to assist you. Now, if I'm digging up bigger herbaceous perennials, like a big ornamental grass, a regular spade will do, but I really prefer a tree spade like this. And this one happens to be solid steel, so it's pretty indestructible. Okay, why do we divide perennials? Well, it's a way to make more out of what we have. And some perennials benefit from being divided because when they get more and more crowded, they become less productive. In a moment, we'll see some daffodils, some narcissus that are no longer blooming well. And they are an example of a bulb. And bulbs are herbaceous perennials that when they get too crowded, they no longer bloom well. So dividing them and spreading them out, in a few years, they'll be back to full bloom again. Some things like this hosta or this daylily do make seed, and you could grow them from seed, but they're not going to look like the original plant. These have very complex genetics and they don't come true from seed. So dividing them is the only way the homeowner has to make more of a lot of herbaceous perennials. Now, let's talk about timing. I'll probably end up saying several contradictory things. There are some plants that have a best time for division, but I think that often the best time to do something is when you have time. We all have busy schedules. And so, we might do it on that rare Saturday when we have a spare hour to work in the garden. Most perennials want to live, they want to grow. So you might have to divide them when it's not the ideal time, but the plant will be fine in the long run. And we'll probably end up demonstrating division of all of these herbaceous perennials on the tabletop, and we can talk about the particulars there. Here we have a daffodil. They've flopped over with the rain. And you can see a lot of these clumps are no longer blooming. And getting too crowded is one reason why they would stop blooming. It's not the only, but these have been in this location long enough that I think that's why they're not blooming. You know, too much shade or cutting the foliage off before it turns yellow. Now, when I was a kid, my mom said you wait till the daffodils die down to transplant them. They will certainly tolerate being divided, as will most spring flowering bulbs, while they're still actively growing. And there's two big advantages. You can find them real readily, and when you replant them, other things are in growth. So you see where the blank spots are in the garden, and you don't end up planting these on top of another dormant daffodil. So I've dug this clump out of the ground. And here's part of the clump. This is a full-size daffodil, so a normal full-size bulb would be about this size, about the size of a medium onion. And you can see these bulbs are quite small. And these bulbs divide real readily. I don't need a tool to pull them apart. Now, sort of the blessing and the curse of these bulbs that have been left alone for a long time is when you divide them up, suddenly you have, 100 bulbs to deal with, because this is only part of this clump. And you can replant them individually, several inches apart, or, I'll demonstrate right here, or you can dig a hole and space them out in the hole. And you can also share them with your friends and family. Maybe this daffodil originally came from your grandmother's garden, so you want to make sure everybody in the family has a good start of it. Oh, we have okay. So, this is an example where you space the bulbs. I'm going to space them about 3 inches apart in this hole. Okay, and now I'm just going to fill the hole back in. Now, it'll take these a couple years to get back to full size and blooming size. None of these will bloom next year, but probably in it'll start blooming. And, you'll have the beautiful flowers again. I won't take the time to water these right away, but that would be the good next step for getting these established. So that's one way to replant them. Or, depending on how far you want to spread them around the garden, you could also plant them individually. If your soil test indicates that you need fertilizer, this would be a great time to fertilize them. Now, having disturbed them, they're going to go dormant faster than these undisturbed ones, but don't worry about it. They'll be back next spring. All right. This Rudbeckia, this is the giant cone flower. We actually want to move it off the edge of the bed. And we could dig out the whole clump and just replant it as one, but we might as well divide it into smaller divisions. And why do we use a fork instead of a shovel for digging these up? Because you preserve more of the roots. Because the shovel, the first thing it's going to do is cut all the roots, but a fork with the tines sparing a lot of the roots. Okay. And this is fairly loose, and I just want to demonstrate this technique of using two forks to divide a big clump if it's not dividing freely. Otherwise, you sort of use them back and forth until you've separated them. A lot of perennials divide freely. Other things are really well connected, one piece to another. So here's the a good part of this clump. Yeah, this is dividing quite readily. I'm not exerting much effort to divide this into smaller clumps. Because we want this to make a nice display, we could stop at this size. But if your goal was to, maximize the number of divisions, you can keep on dividing. And whenever you're dividing a perennial, you hope to end up with pieces that have both roots and shoots. If you end up with just shoots and no roots, then it's not it's not viable. So you can just keep on dividing these down into smaller pieces. And they're ready to get replanted in the garden. I'll pretend to replant them here. We have good soil here, and that comes from 40 years of mulching it with rotted leaves. It used to be a very stiff, cold soil, and it's really gotten better just through mulching. And with most herbaceous perennials, it's real important that you not plant it deeper than it was growing, and you also don't want to plant it too high. You want to make sure you retain that same level that it was growing at before. Okay. And I'm going to step over a few steps that way, if that's all right, Mr. Cameraman. This is spring is an especially good time to divide late summer and fall blooming plants. And what I have here on the edge of the bed is a chrysanthemum. You might recognize the foliage. I must say, I see a few things amongst this chrysanthemum that I don't want. There's a seedling spiderwort, a Tradescantia, and though we just divided a Rudbeckia, I see a different Rudbeckia. And so sometimes digging a plant up and dividing it is a good way to liberate it from the invaders. Okay. Now, this chrysanthemum is really late blooming. blooms about Thanksgiving. Oh, that's actually a purple coneflower seedling there. And the cushion mums that every garden center has for sale in the fall are started about June or so from a single rooted cutting. So, we could replant a little clump like that, but really all you need is a single rooted stem. This little piece, that'll be a nice blooming plant this fall if it has half decent care. But unless your goal is to cover your whole yard in chrysanthemums, you probably want to plant a piece like this that has several stems, but they can be just replant them where you want them. This chrysanthemum, like a lot of hardy chrysanthemums and a lot of the fall blooming asters, benefit from being pinched back, midsummer or so, because otherwise they get tall and floppy, and if you pinch them back, they'll branch out and stand up much better. Okay. Well, there we renovated that stand of chrysanthemums a little bit. They're the chrysanthemums that are winter hardy for us, that are reliably perennial, are very vigorous. So they get very crowded, and you soon have a lot more than you need. Some of the summer blooming, I'm going to use the term bulbs. They're not technically bulbs, but they grow from underground storage units, are starting to come back into growth. And this is a canna. Cannas grow from an underground stem known as a rhizome. Bearded irises grow from a rhizome. So it looks a lot like the ginger root you use in the kitchen. This one forkful yielded a bunch of rhizomes, and they're ready to replant wherever you want them in the garden. Of course, if you've grown the cannas for a bunch of years, you probably have more than you want by this point because they're quite vigorous. This is ready to replant like this. If your goal was to maximize the number of new plants you have, you could snap these into smaller pieces. This one I broke off the lead shoot, but they'll put out new growth from the buds on the rest of the stem. And they're ready to replant wherever you want them. Now, they are in new growth already. If we went down below freezing, they'd get cut back to the ground, but that doesn't set them back at all. They'll just regrow the next warm spell. The hardy Japanese fiber banana, which is a very large herbaceous perennial, already has great big new shoots coming out of last year's stems. But these are ready to replant. I'll just replant them here to demonstrate replanting them. It's actually an area where we need to thin the cannas out. I think the main thing to remember about dividing herbaceous perennials, just get over your fear of hurting them. They'll tolerate real heavy division, and before too long, they won't even look like they were divided at all. Now, if I wanted to create a bigger display than this, I would spread them out even further. But you see, I'm just replanting them to the same depth they were growing. Okay. I think we might look at the perennials I have in pots on the table. Okay. Oh, already. Hello. I showed the daffodil as an example of a spring flowering bulb that you can divide and transplant now. This is a summer blooming bulb. This is a rain lily, a Zephyranthes, and they're wonderful little bulbs that bloom on and off all summer, and their common name rain lily comes from the fact that they tend to bloom a few days after there's a rain, or at least the air pressure change that you have with the new weather system. Many of them are very prolific. The bulbs multiply real quickly. They continue to bloom even when they get real thick, but you can certainly divide them and spread them around the garden. This is exactly the same as dividing the daffodil. I've just pulled them into small clumps. Again, you could divide them into individual bulbs or just replant little clumps. But I highly recommend the rain lilies for summer bloom. Now, I mentioned timing. The best time to divide a daylily is after they're done blooming. At that point, the foliage that was produced at this time of the year in early spring is dying, and they're putting up brand new growth. So by the time they're done blooming is a time of when the plant refreshes itself. Their new shoots this time of year are really fragile. So if you do divide them this time of year, you have to be really careful. And sometimes a real old clump of daylilies will divide fairly readily. But this is when I like to use the garden fork. Not the garden fork, the weeding knife. And I'm first cutting through the crown of the plant. And don't ever divide them by pulling the tops. You'll end up snapping them all off the roots, off the crown of the plant. Now, there are a lot of herbaceous perennials that have stems. You think of things like verbena or lantana or salvias and stuff like that. And those we tend not to divide. We tend to grow them from stem cuttings. But on something like a daylily or a hosta or bulbs, we think of them as not having stems. The truth of the matter is the stem is this little thick part where the shoots arise and the roots arise. If you think of the onion in the kitchen, that little bottom part of the onion that you remove before you chop it up to cook, that is the true stem on an onion. It's a very compressed stem, but when you divide one of these stemless perennials, you need to have a bit of that crown because that's where shoots and roots arise. So I certainly don't need to divide this any smaller than this, but I got this crown dirty, but I don't know if you can see this thick woody part here that's bright white, but I'm probably making a mistake, but I'll see if I can divide this again without wasting half of it. Yeah, that's not a great division, but it has a tiny bit of the crown and it has roots and shoots, so that that should be fine. Now, as far as timing, I did say there's a best time for some things, but I think I tend to, it's not the best time to divide a daylily, but this is in a pot, so it's already out of the ground. So why not divide it now rather than planting the whole thing as one unit in the garden? Because then I could plant, 3 clumps of it in the garden. Maybe what I want in my garden is a mass of this particular daylily, but my budget only allows me to buy one. Well, before I plant it, I could divide it into several pieces and have a bigger mass of it in time. Same thing with this variegated Japanese iris, Iris insata. It's a pretty big plant in this garden, in this pot, and it's going to get planted, but I could certainly divide this into smaller pieces. This variegated form of Japanese iris is a beautiful foliage plant all summer because every leaf is bordered in white. Seems to have a pretty woody bunch of rhizomes. Let's see what I can do. This might be a good time to use 2 forks. Well, making a little bit of progress. That got it part of the way. And very often your hands are your best tools because you can sort of feel what's going on underground. You can feel where it's willing to be separated and where it's not. Yeah, right. Well, we could stop at 2 divisions. That's still a pretty nice size division. Though 2 is always an odd odd number in the garden. It's much easier to work with odd number when you're deciding how to plant things, unless you're doing a formal garden where everything's in pairs. Okay. So we now have 3 divisions from 1. And, planting in the garden, each of these will make a nice display this summer. Now, I'm not going to divide this hosta. They're best to divide when they're either fully dormant or the foliage is fully mature. Hostas are really tough, so it would not hurt the plant if I divided it now. But the foliage is so tender, if I disturb it by dividing it, this foliage is not going to mature properly. And so all this growing season is going to look, less than perfect. But if I wait till this summer when this foliage is mature, I can divide it and replant it because they're growing in shade, so they tolerate being divided in the summertime. And then they'll still look great the rest of the summer. This is a really good time of year to divide the warm season grasses, the ornamental grasses that are dormant now or just coming out of dormancy now, because they will reestablish and still be glorious this summer and fall. And I actually don't have grasses here, but sedges, which are very closely related plants. This one needs its late winter haircut. Somebody's knife isn't very sharp. But this is a quietly handsome little evergreen sedge, Carex divolza from central the Caucasus area, I think. But again, I could divide this into just a few bigger clumps. And this one has been in this pot for quite a while. So, and I'm actually taking my pocket knife to kind of tough in there. This one has been in the pot quite a while. So sometimes dividing them and before you plant them out will sort of jumpstart them. So from that one pot, we have 3 nice divisions. Now I've also seen a commercial nursery that has that produces liners of grasses and sedges, and they will divide them down into just as small as can be, which you could do in the garden, but often in gardens, if you divide them real tiny, they don't establish really well. But I'll show you an example of how small they would go. Well, that's not super tiny, but you see it has shoots and roots. So, commercially, you could do that. Or if you're, if you have something really choice that you want to make as many divisions as possible and you divide them this small, well, then the thing to do maybe would be to pot them up, let them get reestablished before you plant them in the garden. But super tiny divisions often struggle to get reestablished in the garden. So 3 out of the 1, or maybe we could, get 5 all total or something. And, this is another Carex. This is one of the beautiful cultivars of Carex oceamensis, Amaryllis, with the bright chartreuse green foliage. And again, that could be divided into smaller pieces. Couple other shade plants. 2 evergreen shade plants that are really valuable for shade gardens because they, they're evergreen and both of them, especially the rhodea, the deer tend to leave alone. They're also tolerant to dry shade. So, there are a lot of plants that want shade but don't tolerate dry shade. But this is the rhodeas are Japanese sacred lily. Before the lily family got chopped up into many families, it was in the lily family. Tim, what is this in now? Is this in the Convallaceae? Yeah, it might be now in the same family as Lily of the Valley, though the flowers really aren't showy. But I see I could certainly divide this into 3, but it's actually easier and better to divide old clumps rather than this fairly young clump, because then there'll be more division between the individual crowns. But it grows from a really large and slow-growing rhizome. You can see a bit of the thick rhizome right here. It's sort of big and thick like a bearded iris rhizome. And because these are still a little bit early for ideal division, I don't mean time-wise, I just mean the maturity of this plant. But you can see both of these divisions are complete plants, so they will make it, and I would replant those directly in the garden. We do have this big cut spot on the rhizome, but we have a nice amount of root and a nice shoot. So in case you're seeing a little bit of yellow markings in this leaf. This is one of the many variegated selections of Rhodia japonica. And Aspidistra, before too many more weeks go by, it's going to put up new growth. So I, like the Hosta, I like to wait until the new growth is mature. Because if I divide it while the new growth is developing, it's going to look all kind of cattywampus all that year. The plant will survive. The plant will do just fine. You're just going to have to look at its ugly foliage. But when I'm dividing an Aspidistra, and I want to get as many divisions as possible, look at those nice healthy roots. You can see it grows from a rhizome. And already it's divided into 2 separate rhizomes. You know, I could stop now with 2 divisions, but and you can see these bright white little shoots. Those are the new leaves coming up. The new leaves, because the rhizome is the underground stem, but then all you see above ground are the foliage and the very odd flowers that bloom in the spring. But if I want to maximize production, maximize the number of plants I produce, very often I divide it down to a single leaf. That's a single leaf. That certainly will make it. I've divided and replanted Aspidistra in the garden, all summer, fall, and winter, and then they're reestablished before they come back into growth. This is the case where the 2 leaves are too close to each other, that I can't make them into a single leaf division. And let's see, a bit of this rhizome started to travel down into the soil. Here is another division. So that's extreme division. Again, I could have stopped when I had 2 divisions, but I chose not to. Now, with some of these things, if they're old clumps, you'll end up with bits of what look like almost dead rhizome. Well, they're not really dead. They're just sort of like waiting in the wings in case if they need to, put up new growth. But they won't put up new growth unless they're liberated from the lead part of the rhizome. So this piece with no leaves, but it's a nice substantial rhizome, is entirely worth replanting because it will now put up new growth. I don't think it's going to put up new growth this year because it doesn't have any actively growing buds, but I would definitely replant it. Same for the Rhodia. If this Rhodia was many years old, the rhizome would be, not terribly long because they're real slow growing, but let's say 3, 4, 5 inches long. And you can cut that into, like inch-long pieces of rhizome, and they will put up additional shoots. So, go out and buy one big pot of something and divide it before you plant it. Well, a lot of us have sedums in the garden. They're real easy to divide because the plants are succulent, and so they're very tolerant of even having little or no roots when you divide them. Now, another trick with sedums, if one of these stems broke off, you can just stick that in the ground and it's going to root. But this is sedum spectabile. It's upright growing like sedum autumn joy. And when the clumps haven't been divided in a long time, they get so many stems. The majority of them are going to be puny because there's so many of them. So dividing is a good way to sort of revitalize the plant and they often stand up better when they're freshly divided. And it has a fairly woody crown in here. You know, these are nice sized divisions for replanting in the garden. There's still a big chunk of this one. We can continue through it. That's another nice division. So that's division number 3. And good time to pull out some weeds. I'm surprised there's a weed because we don't have weeds here at the Ralston Arboretum. Yeah, and 4 and 5 nice sized divisions. Again, you could go smaller if you wanted more, but these are nice sized divisions. They'll make a lovely display late summer when they bloom. Some things hardly need to be divided. This is a Canterbury bell, a Campanula. The name Campanula comes from the Italian campanella, bell. The flowers are bell-like. And, you know, looking at the growth while the plant was in the top of the pot, I thought that looks like a spreader. And when I knock it out of the pot, you can see it's definitely a spreader. The only thing restraining its spread was the container. So not something to put amongst your tiny little treasures in the rock garden, but if you had a big area where you have a lot of ground to cover, they're beautiful small-scale ground covers with very showy flowers. But dividing a running plant like this, or bee balm, which is Monarda, or any of the culinary mints, you know, this is a division. We have shoots and roots. You know, the main part of the underground part is the rhizome, the underground stem, but there's certainly plenty of roots. So you could plant that directly in the garden or pot it up, and when it's reestablished, plant it in the garden. But this could be divided into almost an endless number of individual plants or small clumps. It's sort of an example of a plant that if somebody has enough to share with you, it might be because it spreads real quickly. But there's a value in these spreading plants when you have a large amount of territory to cover. And Tricertus is another shade plant. The toad lilies. This is a real pretty one called Autumn Glow. It's a real robust one, and the foliage starts to grow every time there's a mild spell in the winter, and then it gets cut to the ground. But once we get past frost, the foliage is just beautiful all summer long, and then it has these very exotic looking flowers in the fall. It spreads, and you know, again, we could divide it into individual pieces like that and plant those out, or we can divide it into smaller clumps and spread them out in the garden. I'll just keep on going. The hardy geraniums, the true geraniums, not the half-hardy pelargoniums, the florist geraniums. Some of them make really tight clumps. This is Geranium sanguineum, the bloody cranesbill, and it has more of a spreading growth habit, but sort of slowly spreading. You can see its rhizomes here. You know, as I work my fingers through here, I'm sort of feeling where the plant is becoming free of the and can be separated. All righty. But this particular geranium, Geranium sanguineum, is one that does really well for us. It almost looks like it'd be an aggressive spreader, but it's not. You know, And I'm not even trying to sell you the plant. But you know, this has just a single leafy shoot on it, but that would be a good sized division to replant in the garden, replanting it to the original depth, and it'll put up a lot more shoots from that underground network of rhizomes. And Geranium sanguineum blooms for quite a few months in the summer, so this will be probably a little bit slow in blooming this year since I'm dividing it now, but it'll soon catch up. Geranium macrorhizum is a really good geranium for shade. I know most geraniums want sun, but there's some that definitely prefer shade, like our native Geranium maculatum. But Geranium macrorhizum, the big root geranium, when you divide it, you're not going to find much root at all, just a thick rhizome like this here. And I was a little bit worried about it when I divided a big clump into many, many small pieces several winters ago. But every piece that I replanted in the garden, you know, sort of never looked backwards, just got better from there on. And Geranium macrorhizum has a real sort of air freshener pine scent, and I think that's why deer don't eat it. Deer like some of the hardy geraniums, but not all. Now this is a ginger lily, and the ginger lilies are related to the culinary ginger and turmeric and galangal. And like the canna we dug up earlier, that would normally be dormant, but this has been in a cool greenhouse this winter. And it's a variegated one called Vanilla Ice. So real beautiful, I think sort of apricot gold flowers in late summer, usually very fragrant. But also, this one is also a beautiful foliage plant. And it is spread enough that it would be hard to get out of the pot. So I just wasted the pot. But you can see these new shoots ready to come up. And this is a new, well, I think this is one we don't yet have in the Arboretum. Is that, yeah. So I'm going to divide it fairly small. And nice, healthy root system. Yeah, I can divide that smaller. Sort of like the aspidistra, where I divided to single leaves. Yeah, that. I can't go smaller than that, but that will certainly make it. It has, you know, you see the new shoot on the rhizome, nice strong leaf. I wouldn't divide a ginger lily this small and replant it in the garden. I'd want to pot these up and let them get reestablished, and then plant them out in about a month's time, probably 6 weeks. But this division has, you know, 2 nice buds there. This one is a little bit less promising looking, but I'm sure it'll put up a new shoot from that old rhizome. All right. This one was already sort of separate of the main one. The ginger lilies are really wonderful late summer, fall blooming. herbaceous perennials for this area, for zone 7. They're not, I don't know that any of them are winter hardy in colder climates, but they're most of the ones, well, all the ones we grow are winter hardy in this area. And they don't have any of the insect problems that cannas do. All right, I ended up with a piece of rhizome with no shoot, but that's entirely worth replanting. I see a little bud starting right there. So again, having been liberated from the growing point of this rhizome, that will put up new growth. And the second piece, when I talk about the old parts of the rhizomes not growing until they're separated from the lead point of the rhizome, it's a little bit like pinching back a plant. That terminal bud suppresses the growth of the axillary buds until you pinch out the tip, like on something sprawly like a coleus or something, and then the side buds can start to grow. So this is sort of the same thing as pinching back a plant with stems. These are two little perfectly good divisions. So, and oh, look what we have here. Look at those nice shoots down there. So today, maybe I'm showing you some fairly aggressive means, degrees of division. Again, you know, if you just want 3 plants and you're starting off with just 1, then just divide them into 3. But if you want to maximize the number of divisions, then you can get aggressive like I have been with these today. This is a really nice mature part of the rhizome with 3 new shoots off of it. So I could divide that smaller. I could even divide like this bottom inch and here and pot them up, and before too long they'll have top growth, especially when the weather's more consistently sunny and warm. All right, these are all the, do we have questions from the audience?
Yeah, Doug, we are going to have Alexa and Catherine inside in the control booth. They're going to read out questions. I'll be able to hear them, okay. And I'll just relay those out loud. So, y'all, whenever you want, you can throw questions out to us. I think one of the things everybody you can see is with dividing perennials, people look at it like it's something really difficult, and you have to be very delicate. And often you got to get out a hefty tool and get to it.
Yeah. When I teach things like this, I really just want people to get over their fear of dividing things, because I was pretty brutal with these, but I'm sure that nearly every last scrap that I produce today will, reestablish and become a perfectly good plant in time. And this is the way a lot of these things are propagated in the nursery industry anyway.
Yeah. And in the wild, a clump of gingers growing by a stream, that part of it erodes away and falls off in a storm and shows up somewhere down stream. Do we have any questions, Alexa, Catherine?
I have one for you.
Okay, go ahead.
With the aspidistra, can you replant the extra roots, or is it only the rhizomes?
So the question was, and I was not here while you were dividing it, but the aspidistra, can you only replant or was it? Repeat that. Can you replant the roots, or just the extra, or just the rhizomes? I'm butchering the question, but
no, I think I understand their question, and there's a difference between the rhizome and the root. The rhizome is an underground stem, and a stem has buds. On most plants, like the aspidistra, you can separate the root from the plant, and it's not going to do anything. Now, there are a few exceptions. Oriental poppies, Phlox paniculata. What are you looking at, Tim? Tim says the Rudbeckia will come from pieces of root. Acanthus will come from pieces of root. But I think the viewer's question, here we go. So all the divisions on most things, you want shoots and part of the crown of the plant, or in this case, the rhizome. But in dividing this aspidistra, I ended up with this piece. This thick part here is the rhizome, the underground stem. It has no shoots, but I would say definitely replanted, because it will put up new shoots eventually. It might not be this spring. It might sit underground until next spring. But definitely, if you have a piece of rhizome, it does not need to have leaves in order to be worth replanting.
Exactly. Yep. That's it. And that's you may have mentioned this, but that's the difference between a potato and a sweet potato. A potato has eyes because it's a underground stem, and a sweet potato would just have roots because it's an underground root. Both storage organs, but both different. And that's why you can cut up a potato and use seed potatoes, the eyes, to grow more. Any other questions?
All right. Next question. Can you divide salvias now?
Can you divide salvias now?
Do I need to repeat the question?
No, everybody can hear when I say it.
Yes, you can divide salvias now. Do we do it? Almost never, because salvias are really easy to root from stem cuttings. And whereas, something like a bulb, the true stem of a bulb is the little basal plate at the base of the bulb from which the shoots and the roots arise. But nearly all salvias, maybe all salvias, have stems, and spring is a super good time to stick cuttings, because when the stems are on a herbaceous perennial or vegetative, they're not yet flowering, they root really readily. So there's some salvias that are in new growth right now that within the next couple of weeks we'll start cutting stems off the plants and sticking them and rooting them. So, Salvia superba, which is maybe the same thing as Salvia nemorosa, like May Night and East Friesland, they are propagated by division more than stems, but any of the salvias with upright stems are better off and more quickly propagated by stem cuttings.
Yeah, it really is going to depend on the growth habits. So the Salvia officinalis, the edible, the culinary sage, you can divide if you want, whereas most the woody salvias or are going to want stem cuttings.
I dug up one of our very few native East Coast native salvias. The salvias are widespread around the world, but very uncommon in Eastern North America. There's huge numbers of them in Western North America, all through Central and South America. But this is Salvia Lirada. You don't know it by name, you know it because it's a real common roadside weed. And Lirada is referring to lyre. I guess that leaf looks a little bit like the musical instrument lyre. And it doesn't have, its stem is this compressed stem underground like a hosta, and it blooms up above the plant. The flowers can be either white or pale blue. And in the wild, the foliage would typically be green, but this is a garden strain with purple foliage. So it would be an example of a salvia that would not be grown from stem cuttings, probably more often just grown from seed.
Other questions?
All right, I have two more on Facebook, and then I will let Catherine take over on the YouTube questions. I have a question. Can you divide hellebores?
Can you divide hellebores?
I was standing here thinking that if Mark didn't get any more questions, I was going to talk about hellebores. Yes, you can definitely divide hellebores, but I need to qualify that. If you have the Christmas rose, which is Helleborus niger, and it's doing well, don't even look at it cross-eyed, just leave it alone and don't even think about moving it. But the Lenten rose, which we used to know as Helleborus orientalis, and now we call Helleborus hybridus, they can definitely be divided. It's a lot of work to dig one up. The crown of the plant is super, super hard, woody. You're going to need probably a saw. You're probably going to need, well, this weeding knife has a bit of a serrated edge. You might be able to do it with that, or you might need to get a tree saw out to divide it. But why would you divide a hellebore? Well, if you have an individual plant that has exceptionally beautiful flowers, that would be the best way to make more of it, because the seedlings are going to be like a litter of mixed breed puppies, everyone's going to look different. Helleborus fetidus, which is the big, tall one with little green bells, I wouldn't divide that. It comes from seeds so quickly, you just transplant the seedlings. But definitely really choice hellebores or wild relatives of the Lenten roses can be divided.
And to tack on to that with something you said, a lot of the Helleborus hybridus do seed. And so sometimes you have a thick bed and people think it is a creeping plant like you've been talking about here that they need to divide. But you have individual plants which will have that very hard crown. But then you might have a lot of seedlings around them. Those you can dig up and move very easily. Those go around. But many of the new ones, the really good new ones, are sterile and don't seed around, which is a good thing most of the time in the garden. And in those, if you have some that get older and you really want more, you're either going to buy them or you're going to have to get your tree saw out to cut them. We'll get another question in just a second. I do want to repeat to everybody, this is our day of giving. You can go to jcra.ncsu.edu and click on donate now. And that supports us. That helps us keep these great programs like Gardening 101 on air and free for everybody, which we really like to do to connect with y'all. We're hoping to get 202 individual donations. Doesn't matter if they're $10 or $10,000. We really want to show the university the breadth of support that we have. So we're really hoping to get 202 donations. Okay, what's the next question you had from Facebook?
All right, my last Facebook question is about tropical plants. They're asking, their dwarf banana tree died back and it's just now waking up again. Can you divide them in the same kind of way?
All right, great question. That's a great one. This is about tropicals or tropical-like plants. They have a banana that died back to the ground and is just now waking up, and they want to know if they can divide it like these other plants.
Yeah, absolutely. A banana is just a very large herbaceous perennial. I don't really have something here that's really comparable to banana, but the true stem on the banana is more like a big elephant ear tuber. It can be pretty massive, but it's just below ground or just above ground level. And I guess you could divide one of those, but mostly what you are dividing is individual stems off of the big clump. The Japanese fiber banana spreads fairly quickly and the stems are 3-4 feet apart. And so you can just go in and, dig up individual stems and replant them. So definitely, the edible bananas and plantains are all sterile. Those little black dots inside are seeds that never develop. So they are only propagated vegetatively, either by division and I guess nowadays by tissue culture.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any questions from YouTube Live?
We sure do. We have quite a few questions. Let's see. Right. We're going to start with a question from Nancy. She wanted to know, how far apart should the ginger roots be planted? I guess when you're dividing the ginger?
Okay, yeah, Nancy wants to know, after you've divided your ginger, how far apart do you plant them?
Well, the ginger is a very robust growing plant. I could plant them 3 feet apart. or if I wanted to make a solid clump more quickly, I could plant them 2 feet apart. Just do a little research and find out what the recommended spacing is for any of these plants. Just, the thing is, if a division is small, that doesn't mean you plant it closer. If the recommended spacing on a rhodia is 18 inches, well, plant them all 18 inches apart, even if the division is small, because they're going to, grow into the same size plant. It's like a tree. When you buy a tree, maybe it's a tiny little seedling. Well, you're not thinking about you're not thinking about the current size of the plant. You're thinking about how big is it going to get when it's mature. So you can plant them at the standard spacing.
Okay,
Nancy, what else got?
There's a question from Cindy, and she wanted to know, should the stalk be cut at the time of division? And I think she's maybe talking about the ginger lily also. Do you cut the stalk back?
So Cindy wants to know, and we think this is also about the ginger, about cutting the stalk back. Do you cut the stalk back at the same time?
Oh, yeah, I understand the question. Yeah. Most of the things I divided today don't really need their tops reduced. But, when you divide a plant when it's in full growth, you do need to cut it back to some degree just to bring it in better balance. So you might cut the ginger off about halfway. I appreciate that question because that's something I overlooked to mention. The other reason to cut it back, if you're planting it directly in the ground, is that this is a big sail, like on a sailboat, and it's blowing and it's rocking the root. It'll establish better if it's moving around less. So cutting a plant back that's in active growth at the time you divide it is important.
Yeah, and often if you're dividing in winter, if you were dividing your clump of gingers during a cold winter, you won't have stalks on them at all anyway. You'll only have the rhizomes.
Yeah, and I mentioned that the best time to divide daylilies is when they're done blooming, and their natural life cycle is that this foliage they put up in the spring is dying at that stage, and they're putting up fresh new growth after they're done blooming. So even if you're not dividing your daylily, a tip I like to share is when they're done blooming, cut the whole plant to the ground or close to the ground, and you clear away all that old foliage that is just going to go from green to brown. And then the rest of the summer into fall, you're just looking at fresh green new growth that was produced at the time that they're finishing blooming. And so if you're dividing them, that's also a natural time to cut them back really hard.
That's a great tip.
Okay, the next question would be, would you prune back the roots when you're making divisions or replanting?
Okay, question was, would you prune back the roots when you're dividing your perennials?
No, you want as much root as possible.
Yeah.
More root under the ground, the better.
Yeah, it's all about the roots. You don't want to prune them back. If you have something, especially out of a container, often, sometimes you'll have some dead roots in there, that you can go off, but that'll be kind of dark, not very good looking stuff. This
geranium division is based on the top is fairly small, but it's going to take off much quicker with all this root and rhizome underground than if it was a smaller division. This division will reestablish well, but it would have reestablished much more quickly if I had left it attached to all that underground growth.
All right, we've got a surprise guest. I want to see if he'll join us. No? Oh. All right, come on. You got to get in front of the camera for a minute here. All right, I'm going to get you to talk about one plant. This is Dr. Danny Werner, former director of the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, one of my favorite people because he hired me here, who also taught herbaceous plants. But I'm going to get you to just give us a little bit of information. Denny started his career as a peach breeder, now is a red bud breeder and butterfly bush breeder, among other things. But one of the things I was told I had to mention while we were talking was this incredible little plant flowering behind us. And I just wonder if you could say a little something about that plant.
Sure. Yeah, I did some peach breeding first 20 years here at NC State, and mostly worked with fruiting varieties, but there's a lot of beautiful ornamental variation in peach. And when the opportunity arose, we exploited that. In fact, JC encouraged some of that early ornamental peach breeding work. Some of you who visit the Arboretum may be familiar with the little double red dwarf that Tim may have already spoken about today. Not yet? Okay, I'm sorry. Which is an icon of the Arboretum that predates my presence here. Some of the ornamental peaches in the trade are dwarf and have purple leaf color. Purple is an interesting mutation in peach, and there's one of those behind us right here. Is that the one you're referring to, Mark? You want me to talk about?
Yeah.
Hope I got the right plant.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, the name is escaping me.
It's Bonfire.
Bonfire, yeah, that's right. Okay. Bonfire was developed by the University of Arkansas. It's got purple leaves, what we call the brachytic dwarf character, which leads to a much reduced stature. I can't recall how old those two specimens are there, but they're probably,
They're at least 20.
yeah, I was going to say 15 to 20 years old, which gives you a sense of how slow they have grown to attain the height that they are at right now. We've been doing some ornamental peach breeding. If you visit the Arboretum, you might see some of the columnar peaches in the Arboretum. I noticed there's one right up here in the perennial border. That's the Corinthian series that we released, yes, now 22 years ago, I believe.
Wow.
And we're still doing a little bit of work with some of the ornamental peaches. They're just great plants to have in the garden. And I'm happy to be here to talk about them. Impromptu, unrehearsed.
This was fantastic because I was going to say that beautiful flowering peach behind Doug is Bonfire. It's a dwarf with purple foliage, and it's slow grower. It was here when I started 14 years ago, and that was going to be the extent of it, which is why I love working here at NC State, because it's not just about what it looks like and what it does, but it's about the science behind it.
About the science and the history
and the history and everything. Very
interesting. Yes.
So
thank you so much.
I appreciate you stopping by and joining in.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Denny's a woody plant breeder. We talked about the red buds. He's great work with that, but he's a fantastic gardener and taught herbaceous plant materials for many, many years, and has a incredible garden at home that my wife said when we visited, said, "Why didn't your garden look a little more like that?" Oh, well. She says that a lot when we visit people. We have any more questions?
Mark, we do. There was a couple questions about, one was particularly about separating huge bearded iris rhizomes. And then there was another one about Amaryllis that have been in the ground for a long time. So they're kind of along the same lines.
Okay, well, two questions about two plants that have been in the ground for a long time. Old bearded Iris germanica, that have been in the big clumps that have been in for a long time, and same with Amaryllis.
Okay. Bearded iris is a plant that most often, if it's been in one spot for a long time, no longer blooms really well. They really benefit from being divided and spread around. If it's a real old clump, you might end up with far more divisions than you need. So just replant the biggest ones and compost the rest, or share them with gardening friends. There are some very old varieties of bearded iris that continue to bloom well even when they're crowded, but most bearded irises benefit from being divided, every third year or so. If it's not going to bloom this spring, you can go ahead and divide it. Normally, they're divided after they bloom or anytime through the summer months. Amaryllis probably will keep on blooming even when they get crowded, but if you want to increase the rate of increase, then divide them, because the smaller bulbs that are crowded in with the blooming sized bulbs just won't amount to much unless they're separated out. And then, plant them individually or in small clumps, but spread them out much further. So it's a plant that would definitely benefit from being divided as well.
Yeah. Another one that's like that, where you get big old clumps, are Crinum. In that case, have an extra shovel, because you'll break the first one trying to dig them up. They're tough.
Or the football team that helped us dig up Crinums when the border was redone in 2000.
There you go.
Yeah.
Other questions? While you're looking at the questions, I just want to mention again that today's Day of Giving, and the fact that we can provide this kind of education for free is because of your support. We're free to come in and visit. We don't charge people to come in. And you've probably, if you've been with us much of the day, you've probably seen some families behind us. Might have heard some of them, which is great. We love it. It's been too long since we've had people in the garden. But we are free. The university doesn't provide a lot of support. They provide some salaries for a couple of people, but all of our operating expense, most of our salary, the only way we can afford the expertise of somebody like Doug is because we're supported by people like you. So we really do encourage you to go to jcra.ncsu.edu when we're finished up, and click on Donate Now. We don't ask you all the time for donations of money, but we really do hope you'll support us, and I hope you'll whether you live nearby or you live farther away and are and enjoy these programs. We hope you'll join as a member. Today only, we've got our membership at $45. It's a discounted rate in celebration of our 45th anniversary. Family membership is at $70, also discounted rate. And you can get to that from our website as well, jcra.ncsu.edu. We're hoping to get to 202 gifts today. We're doing, this is Gardening 101. We're hoping to double that, make it twice as good, make it 202. We're up to 163 gifts. So we need 39, if my math is correct. Math is not my strong suit, but Dennis says yes, and he knows more than me. We're up to $92,539 in gifts. There's also an anonymous $275,000 planned gift to support internships, which is, we cannot say enough how much we appreciate the people who are supporting us. And that's whether it's you're donating $10 or $25 or $500 or $275,000. We really do appreciate it. All right, I think I interrupted you, Catherine. Do you have another question there?
There's a few more. There's a question about Penstemon. Would you divide that, or would you take leaf cuttings or stem cuttings?
All right. This is going to be a little bit like the Salvia, Penstemon. Would you divide that?
Well, Penstemons vary. Our East Coast natives, and Tim, here, dig up one of those Penstemon Digitalis and bring it back here. Our native East Coast Penstemons, the only stems they have are not true stems, or the flower stalks. They grow from a basal rosette. So they're more often grown from seed, but if they can also be divided. Now, a lot of the West Coast or Western, not West Coast, but Western Penstemons grow with stems, and so they are easy to propagate from stem cuttings. This is our local native Penstemon Digitalis. I know that name means Penstemon foxglove. Digitalis is the scientific name for foxglove. Well, that's because the flowers look like foxgloves. But this is, the wild Penstemon Digitalis have green leaves. There are, but this is an old seed strain called Husker's Red. But nowadays there's improved purple foliage ones like Onyx and Pearls and a number of others. I don't remember.
I believe we'll have a good one in our spring plant sale.
Wonderful. I probably unloaded them yesterday. But it has a woody crown. But see, this is sort of like a single crown division. And so I've divided it like I would a daylily or a hosta. So, look at the plant. Is it a big rosette of basal foliage or does it have stems? If it has stems, then take cuttings and root them. I'm telling you this doesn't have a stem. Well, it does have a very short stem, but that's the crown of the plant. And these purple foliaged penstemons are beautiful all winter long. The flowers are real showy in late spring, early summer. And it's a plant that bumblebees really like the flowers. It's also a good cut flower. So that one clump, I'm dividing it into about 8 divisions. That's a fairly small division. That's a nice big one. And they're ready to replant. And would I normally divide these this year? No, because when they bloom this spring, their flowers are going to be kind of puny, but certainly the plant will reestablish and bloom nicely next year. I'd probably divide them when they're done blooming.
And much like salvias, penstemons there are a lot of different ones, which unlike salvias, though, they're only found here in North America. Although a lot of the breeding's been done in Europe. So I want to interrupt our questions real quick to make an announcement. We've got another really major gift to announce. This is a good garden friend of the Arboretum, Phil and Jane Dark, who owned Oakmont Nursery. And you may know Phil through his breeding, if you're familiar with Crown Jewel Gardenia, or Prince Charles, which is being sold as Steady as She Goes gardenia through the Proven Winners program now. They have left a planned gift of more than $500,000 in support of ornamental plant breeding at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. We hope we don't get that anytime soon because Phil and his wife are wonderful people and we want them to be around for a long time. But Phil opened Oakmont back in 1987 in Siler City, North Carolina. The connection with the J.C. Ralston Arboretum and NC State began even earlier in Phil's career and has continued to grow. He vividly remembers meeting J.C. Ralston in person. They discussed gardenia varieties, and J.C. provided cuttings that became key to the establishment of his nursery. In more recent years, Phil has served several terms on the Arboretum's Board of Advisors. We wanted to change our bylaws because he had served for 3 terms and had to rotate off, but we loved having him on there. Phil's breeding with gardenias, we hope to continue. Either he'll continue on his own, or we hope we can partner with him and help that continue, because he's brought gardenias to an entirely different place. All of us here at the Arboretum, all our staff, we really appreciate what he's done. We love going to visit him. We've brought interns out there to evaluate the gardenias in bloom. But just want to say congratulations to Phil and Jane on Phil's retirement. I hope that's congratulations to Jane too on his retirement. Really, this is just amazing. So we've got over $750,000 of planned gifts for the Arboretum. We're still trying to get up to 202 gifts. We're at 168, so we have 34 gifts to go any size. If you want to leave another $500,000 for an endowment, we would love to have the insert your name now endowment alongside the Phil and Jane Dark endowment. So, but we're also happy with a $10 gift or a $25 gift if you appreciate what Doug does, what Tim does, Chris, Dennis, everybody here. Another question.
There's sort of a follow-up question on the Penstemon. Are they deer resistant?
Follow-up question on the Penstemon. Are they deer resistant?
I'm thinking that they are. Yeah, Chris is nodding his head in agreement.
I have that one native in my yard, and I don't think the deer touched it.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, it's not one that I think the consensus is no, unless you have deer that like Penstemon.
Well, the deer are eating everything in my yard this year, so they ate my iris. I do have another question.
One more quick question.
Okay, Paul from Wilmington, who's our regular in midweek program, wanted to know if there are disease or insect issues with ornamental peaches.
Okay, we're getting away from the dividing herbaceous plants with our last one. Are there disease and insect pests with ornamental peaches? Yes. They tend not to be as bad, but like we get black knot on them and things like that, but it doesn't seem to affect them as much. They'll still flower. And actually, we're just as soon them not have that much fruit on there because the fruit isn't edible. It's basically fuzzy skin over the pit. But I don't remember like mildew being bad on these out here.
Yeah, the main problem with the peaches that are grown for eating is that the fruit on the trees are extremely susceptible to brown mold. And so they are sprayed continuously to keep the fruit covered with fungicide, but these aren't being grown for fruit. And the foliage is clean all summer. I've never seen the foliage discolored or damaged. And the red one makes quite a bit of fruit. I don't remember seeing mold on the fruit when it's on the plant.
No, there's no flesh there for really to grow into. So yeah, I mean, we certainly have in 20 years of that being in the border there, it has never been sprayed. Can tell you that right now. And it looks great. Okay. So that is going to finish us up for our midweek program, Gardening 101.